All right, so we got what I'm calling On the Contradictions of Capital, which is based on 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism by David Harvey, with some Mao and Marx sprinkled in there.
Featuring Mao Zedong and Karl Marx like it's a fucking mixtape.
I mean, David Harvey extensively borrows a lot of Marx's analysis, and
Oh yeah,
I think
obviously.
just focusing on specifically contradictions is like a direct nod to Mao. It's like kind of obvious. If you know,
Yeah,
you know. It's one of those. Like, he doesn't say it explicitly that meant that much.
it's not subtle.
Yeah. So like I said, part one, I'll be doing part one and part three, but part two maybe for a rainy day. I'll get back to that.
All right.
All right. So first, just quick overview of contradiction. So what we're referring to here is when two seemingly opposed forces are simultaneously present within a particular situation, an entity, a process, or event. And then he follows it up by saying contradictions have a nasty habit of not being resolved, but merely moved around through, and I just added through time or space. So I can sort of, so we see this with like, for example, the periodic crises that capitalism experiences, or so they're not moving, they're not just disappearing and then reappearing. They're basically moving through time, so in a big cycle, or they move through space. So you might have crises in particular regions, but not other regions, and so on and so forth.
I have a really good analogy for this actually.
Okay, I'll let you give that in 1 second. Mao's summary of it is the interdependence of the contradictory aspects present in all things, and the struggle between these aspects determine the life of all things and push their development forward. There is nothing that does not contain contradiction. And capital and capitalism is full of them. All right, go ahead.
Not much of an analogy, more of a anecdote or example. Uh, the unhoused issue, the invisible poverty, invisible crime, right? You have these people that are, like the NIMBY crowd, the YIMBY crowd, all these people, they ultimately what they want is just to not see the, the downtrodden, the people who are refugees from our own economic system. They don't want to see that. They don't necessarily want to solve it, but they want it out of the way. And so you have essentially, as you were saying, an unresolved contradiction. It gets moved around. You got the homeless sweeps. They go and they trash a bunch of like homeless people's stuff and evict them from a parking lot or a park or what have you. But as you said, they don't disappear. They don't go away. The contradiction still exists. They've just been moved.
Yeah, and it to me is like you can just apply like the basic physics principle of inertia, right? Like things in motion tend to stay in motion. Things at
Mm-hmm.
rest tend to stay at rest. So unless there is
And
a outside force that resolves the contradiction, which would
that
usually require revolutionary action, it's just gonna keep on chugging.
Yes, and I could even add more to that to say that, okay, so there's, say, a free kitchen set up by a mutual aid network that, causes a congregation of unhoused people in a certain area. And then, the, like, reactionary forces, they don't want to see that. They don't want other people to see that. They want everything to be looking like it's going fine. And so they use state violence to evict them, to move them. And then, as again, like you were saying, the physics, the equal and opposite reaction is that, okay, so some crust punk anarchist kids go and burn down some fucking cop cars. And then that is in itself used as justification to enact more violence on the unhoused populations.
And so it goes. Yep.
That's
All right.
just from my personal
Yeah.
experience.
No, and it's actually funny you mentioned housing out the gate, because Harvey actually uses the 2008 housing crisis as like a contemporary example for a lot of these contradictions.
Well, yeah, I mean,
So,
a lot of people were, they lost their houses. A lot of
oh yeah,
people are either thrust into, the precarity of, renting something they can barely afford, or living out of their vehicles. And yeah, no, that heightened the contradiction for sure.
oh yeah, definitely. And I at the end I can go back through the chapters and we can maybe look at some of the examples he gives with some data, which is sad but interesting. All right.
Yeah.
Um, next half, I guess, of just a quick review, even though it's not that quick, is capital, which is sort of the subject here. And Harvey's pretty clear to just distinguish, like, that what he's specifically talking about in this text is capital, not necessarily capitalism. Because capitalism is the whole entire, like, socio-political economic system. So that would also include lots of social contradictions and, I guess you'd say, like, superstructural contradictions. We're not going to be focusing on those as much, although they're in here sprinkled. So yeah, we're basically just me focusing on like the economic engine. That's it, capital. What is it? The social relation of capital, all of its weird eccentricities and contradictions and all that. So to refresh our memory from good old Carl, he says capital does not consist in the fact that accumulated labor serves living labor as a means for new production. It consists in the fact that living labor serves accumulated labor as the means of preserving and multiplying its exchange value. David Harvey says, but what capital deals in, and this is what makes this mode of production distinct, is labor power as a commodity. Capital pockets the added value as profit and can store that added value as an ever-increasing concentration of money power. And then again from Carl, in the crises of the world market, the contradictions and antagonisms of bourgeois production are strikingly revealed. Instead of investigating the nature of the conflicting elements which erupt in the catastrophe, the apologists content themselves with denying the catastrophe itself and insisting, in the face of the regular and periodic reoccurrence, that if production were carried on according to their textbooks, crises would never occur. So that's sort of, hopefully that last quote is giving this is basically the idea of this project, right? And this is what Marx was doing, this is what Lenin did, and this is what Harvey's continuing to do, and lots of Marxists hopefully are doing this all the time because conditions are always developing. And yeah, so the practice here, to kind of give a little nod to On Practice, right, is we want to reveal the actual inner workings of things and not just take their surface level appearances for granted, right? That's the project. That's what makes it a social science. Okay, part one, foundational contradictions. And then this is another just good quote on the same topic, right? If everything were as it appeared on the surface, there'd be no need for science. Okay, number one contradiction, use value and exchange value. The aim of the producer, in this case capitalist, is to procure exchange values, not use values. The creation of use values for others is a means to that end. The speculative quality of that activity means, however, that it is potential exchange values that matters, and there's always risk. All the commodities in a capitalist society have a use value and an exchange value. The use values are infinitely varied, and even for the same item, while the exchange value under regular conditions is uniform and qualitatively identical. This is just saying that all dollars are worth the same, and even if you are using a different currency like euros or whatever the fuck, you can just exchange it with dollars and it operates exactly the same. All right, so why is this such a big contradiction that's fundamental to capital? Well, commodities are pretty essential for capital to accumulate and to reproduce itself. And every commodity has, like it says, use value and exchange value. But what's interesting is that the exchange value and use value of the commodity, they have a relationship in the sense that you can only sell something to somebody if they need it, or at least want it. Need or want, I guess, work. Basically, they have to buy it for some reason. And the reason they're buying it is use value. However, the reason you are selling it is not use value, it's exchange value. Because you have to realize a profit. That's a pretty humongous contradiction. Because, as I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with, there's a ton of shit that gets sold all the time that is basically, there's no real like measurable relationship. Like it says, like use values can be anything. They're infinitely varied. They can be for like maybe it's just a piece of art that gives you like warm feelings. I don't know how you quantify that. Or it could be something like basic to your survival, like water or food or something. But regardless, you're taking all these various ways you can use commodities, and there's like a million of them, and you have to put a fixed number on it that is measured in money, dollars. It's measured by some sort of money. That's another pretty glaring contradiction, because how can you put a price on how you use things? Well, it's because, as we'll get to in a little bit, that's kind of its own contradiction, which is mostly money as a representation of value. But get to the next part here. So here are two examples, and actually the old man hinted at this one basically immediately, because we're all probably relatively familiar with it as a pretty ridiculous example that affects a lot of people. So he says, in the 2008 property market crash in the U.S., about 4 million people lost their homes through foreclosure. For them, the pursuit of exchange value destroyed access to housing as a use value. So this is a consequence of commodifying housing in this country. He says the same thing happens to healthcare and education, as exchange value considerations increasingly dominate the use value aspects of social life. So yeah, I mean, if all of your focus and energy as a capitalist is focused on maximizing exchange value, while I would probably say minimizing use value, right? Because you don't want to put all the buzzers and whistles and bells on your product. Like, I can tell you guys, as I've taken a kind of nonsense entrepreneurship course before, they literally teach you that. They're like, do not put any more features in your product than you absolutely have to, right? And we also know this is also where you see what's it called, planned obsolescence, right? Make it as shitty and cheap as possible, basically as close to useless as you can, usually because that's cheaper to produce, while maximizing its price. And you can maximize price a lot of different ways. That you can have a monopoly. You could also have a monopoly through intellectual property. You could have a monopoly on use by, it could be land ownership, right? So you're maximizing exchange value by owning a house, but you're minimizing use value by only doling it out as like a rental, right? So that the person living there doesn't actually own it, and they can't use it the way they might choose to, because they have to obey a contract, a lease of some kind. So this pops up all over the place, really. Literally pick any commodity that you interact with in your life, and you can analyze this contradiction yourself and figure out why it was made, like I said, as shitty as possible. and sold for as much as possible. Okay. Next, I probably should have just made this 2 slides, but let's go with it. This is all about money. Money, the social value of labor and its representation by money. So this is the social representation of, or social value of labor is referring to essentially this labor theory value, right? And that is in contradiction with the fact that value is measured or represented by money, which is also a commodity. And we'll see why that's weird in a second. So he says, first, just to get a kind of a definition, right? Money is a means of circulation. It facilitates exchanges in a way that solves issues with direct barter, and it provides a way to store value over time. Okay. Now, this is more on value, because value is a social relation. Being immaterial and invisible, value requires some material representation. Money is inseparable, but also distinct from the social labor that constitutes value. But money hides the immateriality of social labor, aka value, behind its material form. So he's already hinting at what what you could basically understand as like a fetishism, right? Of money has like this mystical power about it, but most people don't really understand it, and they're not really sure why it has. Why do people want money? Why do people need money? It masks the social relation that is value, which is a claim on the social labor of someone else. I mean, basically, if I give someone like, what's the minimum wage in the U.S.? It's like $7.25 an hour, right?
Yeah.
It's like if I give someone $7.25 for, I don't know, some reason, like I'm basically purchasing an hour of their labor. It's not the best example, but it's social. I should also clarify, like, social labor is not literally an hour or something like that. It's a social average, essentially, right? It's the average amount of labor that gets done in an hour for a certain labor process. So it's a little more complicated than just that, but just think money. With money, you buy someone else's social labor. That's essentially the idea. Now, he also mentions here that the relation between money and value is dialectical and coevolutionary. They both emerge together rather than causal. And I mean, if this doesn't sound like Mao, I don't know what does. So yeah, money and value as a social relation emerge together. So the abstraction of money goes along, what's it called, part and parcel with money as the representation of it. So money itself becomes a kind of continuing on. This is a little bit more about money as a commodity. Money itself becomes a kind of commodity called money capital. Its use value is that it can be used to produce more value. This is surplus value specifically. Its exchange value is the interest payment, which in effect puts a value on that which measures value. A highly tautological proposition. So, just for clarification, tautological, for those who aren't familiar, just means it's an identity in like mathematics. So it'd be like saying 1 equals 1 or x equals x. It's a meaningless statement, basically. It's a statement that doesn't actually tell you any more information than you already had. That's what tautologies are.
Yeah.
And that's kind of built into money, especially when you start using it as a commodity. So when it says the exchange value of money is the interest payment, right? If I give the old man like $1,000 at 10% interest, he would give me back 1,001. $100. So effectively, I'm getting $100 in profit from that exchange. And the use value is that the old man is using it to do capitalism and make and produce surplus value by exploiting his workers, hypothetically. So that's how money is used in the economy, and this is mostly how it's used by capitalists, I should clarify, because workers who are not interested in making surplus value, they instead are doing the opposite. In a sense, they're selling labor or labor power specifically in exchange for money, and then they take that money and use it to exchange for commodities that they need in order to survive. So food, water, clothing, shelter, all that stuff. So it's a little bit different. I'll just put a note basically that a working class individual proletarian would have a different perspective on this, but regardless, it's still a bizarre. It's bizarre that the thing which measures value can also be exchanged for more value. It's just like, it's very odd and it causes a lot of problems. Like debt crises, for example.
Don't forget NFTs.
Yeah, there is some stuff in the book I didn't cover about like fiat currencies, right? So like the more abstractions you make, like away from the social labor that constitutes the value of your currency, right? It's like your NFTs or crypto, they're all just abstractions. They're getting further and further from what the actual basis of their value is. And that's what causes them to be so unstable. All right. A couple more things here. The desire for money as a form of social power becomes an end in itself, which distorts the neat demand-supply relation of the money that is required to facilitate exchange. This throws a monkey wrench into the supposed rationality of capitalist markets. So yeah, because money can afford you a social power over other people, that becomes a goal for some individuals, right? They just... It also... It's a side effect that sort of keeps people materially interested in accumulating capital, right? So you might ask, like, okay, well, why would anyone, if capitalism is so bad, like, why would anyone participate in it? Well, this is why. Like, if you happen to be a capitalist, and you can literally set your own salary, you get a shit ton of money that you can use for, dominating other people, essentially, as a social power, and that can become an end in itself for some people. The rise of the money form and the capacity for its private appropriation has created space for the proliferation of human behavior that are anything but virtuous or noble. So again, the kind of abstracting and alienating effects of money can cause people to do pretty shitty things to one another to get more money, even if they're not really conscious of why they even want money in the first place. Like, what's the reason? Okay. Private property in the capitalist state. Another fun contradictions our libertarian friends still haven't
refuse to acknowledge.
Yeah, they still haven't quite.
It's not a haven't gotten it. It's they refuse to freaking interact with it.
Fair enough. Yeah. All right. So first, just some quick definition of private property, right? It establishes an exclusive ownership right to a thing or process, whether it is being actively used or not. Private property rights presuppose a social bond between that which is owned and a person. The eradication of usufructuary rights and the infamous process of the enclosure of the commons have led to the dominance of a system of individualized private property rights backed by state power as the basis for exchange relations and trade. The balance of this contradiction between private interests and individual liberties on one hand and state power on the other has shifted most decisively in recent years towards the undemocratic, autocratic, and despotic centers of the state apparatus, where they are backed by increasing militarization of social control dedicated to the support of capital rather than to the well-being of the people. So other than, I would assume, a little bit of sarcasm of individual liberties and private property being equivocated, but basically, yeah, private property wouldn't be possible without a state apparatus of social control, like it says, to enforce it, because otherwise there'd be no basis in whatsoever for an exclusive ownership to something.
There is no mandate of violence to enforce capital freaking circulation without a state to make it exist.
Right. And this contradiction is the short and sweet way to just immediately be like, yep, anarcho-capitalists are brain dead and don't understand how any of this works. Because if you told someone like, hey, you can't pick my apple trees because you're hungry, and they're like, oh, why is that? And you're like, because I'll be really angry and it's my private property. They're just going to pick your apples and eat them because they're hungry. But if you're allowed to just pull out a gun and shoot them, and the state is like, yeah, that's totally fine. Or you can call the police and they'll shoot them for you. That's also totally fine. Either way, the state is involved in enforcing the property right. They're intricately linked to one another. And again, that doesn't mean the contradiction isn't always non-antagonistic. It does become antagonistic, right? Because when you do have, albeit rare, instances where you might have policies passed that do sort of favor like working class interests. So think of like the New Deal era, where he basically had Roosevelt freaking out because he was worried there'd be a American Bolshevik Revolution. So he teamed up with the capital interests and said, okay, we need to give at least some of these demands in, otherwise we're going to all get murdered. So that's what they did, right? They gave some concessions, which did threaten private property interests. So you do have occasional situations where the state and private property are not in cahoots. It just depends on the situation, obviously. And that's exactly what we read in Mao, right? Is that, and contradictions only become antagonistic under specific conditions. And that's exactly how this contradiction works, like the rest of them, is that, the state and private property, or specifically private property owners, right? They get along swimmingly, actually, in most cases. But they also get angry because they're like, I don't want to pay any more property taxes or whatever. Taxes are too dang high. And it's like, well, maybe it's because you own like 3 or 4 rental properties in town, and you're fucking people over that way. So maybe you should pay actually taxes. It'd be cool. So anyways, yeah, this is an interesting one that I think right-wingers just, their brains break when they think about it too hard. All right, next is private appropriation and commonwealth. So he says there's two ways to privately appropriate commonwealth. The first one is theft, robbery, usury, and just generally like predatory practices of just basically taking people's shit without their consent. Or there's the other like accepted way of doing it is free market exchange. So getting an access to some portion of the Commonwealth by selling, let's say, something of equal value. That's how the theory works, at least. Bourgeois theory is. However, Harvey basically suggests, well, there's theoretical grounds for believing that an economy based on dispossession lies at the heart of what capital is all about. So he says, actually, even though that first part is sort of what people typically understand, and they're pretty much the same thing. Those free market exchanges where people accumulate public wealth into private hands, yeah, that's pretty much just predatory and would classify as theft, robbery, or usury under most definitions. If you actually analyze how wealth is appropriated. And he says at the heart of this process of private appropriation of the Commonwealth lies the contradictory way in which money represents and symbolizes social value. So we're coming back to money. And yeah, people are totally, and we hear this sometimes, right, where people might say, oh, like, I'm totally fine if, we tax the rich on, like, income or something, but, like, don't touch their wealth, because that's accumulated. They already earned that, and it's like, well, assuming they're, like, actual capitalists, there's a good chance they are just appropriating that from their workers. And basically the point, I think, is that people don't view money as social labor, typically. Again, if they haven't read
May I
it
ask
out
something?
Oh, yeah.
So the obvious one of the most obvious counters to people saying that the wealthy have earned their wealth is that a lot of them were born into it, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry, my train of thought is awful here. It's very skewed. But is there any like liberal rationalization of inheritance?
Do you mean like how someone who's extremely wealthy would rationalize it?
No, just like anyone who's in favor of capitalism and thinks it's like just. How would they justify this inheritance of mass wealth?
Oh, I mean, I think it's just because money is a store of value and you already have money. I think, again, people, if you like tax it, for example, if you have like a wealth tax.
Yeah. Sorry, that question probably wasn't for you since you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like trying to think about, because I'm like any.
You can't justify it really.
Sounds so stupid. It's like hard to think that way.
Yeah, because it is that stupid.
Yeah, it is. I don't know. I guess they would basically just. They might honestly lean on like, oh, we all earned it, like my ancestors earned it, and it's like, well, they probably killed and murdered and enslaved people for it, but that would put them on the defensive, and they would start calling the police or something. I don't know. I'm not sure. There's not that many rational justifications for it. I'll give you that much.
A common justification I've heard is that like the people that have made a lot of money or have come into possession of a lot of money are just, have specific skills that allow them to manipulate the market, and that makes them worthy.
It's capital worship at that point. Because almost every one of them from that fricking angle inherited massive amounts of wherever they started, or happened to come into power. Warren Buffett. Because Daddy was a congressman and insider trading's not illegal.
Yeah, but even people who haven't been just capitalist apologists in general who are not even capitalists themselves use this argument, and that's when it's like, bruh, seriously?
Yeah, just kind of a blink blankly at them and go, so why do you hate yourself so much? And see if it defuses them a little bit. Or go, wow, it's exceedingly gay to like capitalism that much. You should stop. You should stop liking capital like that. It's wrong.
Yeah. Like I said, there's not that many rational arguments I can think of. They're mostly irrational appeals to emotion or some vague notion of like meritocracy, I guess, which we all know is bullshit anyways, so yeah. It'd be something like that, I guess. So the last quote I just put, everything under the sun must in principle and whenever technically possible be subject to commodification, monetization, and privatization. So, this is kind of connected in some ways with the private property in the state contradiction, right? Because we have, for example, like publicly funded universities and technology institutions and so forth that produce all kinds of interesting technology and innovations that can just be bought by private interests and be privatized. And okay, there's something that I would consider commonwealth, right? Something we all collectively contributed towards. And by the way, it doesn't have to be just like the scientists or whoever made the thing. It doesn't have to be the immediate workers involved. It's also all the infrastructure, the energy grid, any sort of information on the internet that might have been used, or just kind of historical information and the history of human knowledge that can accumulated in this discovery. That's all commonwealth. Like, it's hard to... Yeah, we can point to, like, individuals throughout history who may have had, like, larger than average contributions, like your Newtons, Einsteins, etc. But usually they were built, like, it was the frickin' Newton quote, right? It's like, if I had seen farther, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. So that's how you should think of the Commonwealth. It's basically things that humanity has produced as a collective effort. Again, whether it was conscious or not, but these products of our Commonwealth are routinely privately appropriated and sold back to us at a upcharge. It's a very, very sinister process.
And we know it's an upcharge because that's the only way they can make money.
I mean, it's not the only way, because they also appropriate labor power, or just the products of labor, which is kind of its own process, which is the next slide. So that's a good transition, hopefully. But no, I mean, this is another stage, right, in the accumulation, because ultimately, the only way capital can grow is by consuming and appropriating the product of of human labor. So this is a good summary. The effect is to transform social labor, the labor we do for others, into alienated social labor. Work and labor are exclusively organized around the production of commodity exchange values that yield the monetary return upon which capital builds its social powers of class domination. Workers, in short, are put in a position where they can do nothing other than reproduce, through their work, the very conditions of their own domination. This is what freedom under the rule of capital means for them. So, I didn't go crazy on this chapter because this is essentially what Capital, volumes 1 through 3, are, I'll say mostly volume 1 actually. Is what volume 1 analyzes in detail. And if you want more of this, go look up the Wage, Labor, and Capital presentation from earlier. I'm going to get more into this relation. I just kind of picked this quote as a good summary of it, right? Because what we're all pretty familiar with is that we don't have much of a choice in the matter. We have to work for a capitalist because we don't own anything. I don't have any of my own food to eat. I don't have my own land or property to live on, etc., etc. So I have to work for someone else in order to get money to pay for all those things. And that is how capital and labor are linked at the hip, because capital needs labor to feed off of and grow, and like it says, accumulate the social powers with which it uses to dominate labor. And labor needs capital because labor would die without it, because capital owns everything. They've privatized everything, because they've enclosed the commons. Everything is now private property, so on and so forth. We're all pretty familiar with this. And he actually mentions in the text, which is interesting, is that, he kind of suggested that this contradiction kind of gets like an above average amount of attention because it's like very thoroughly explored in volume 1 of Capital. However, it's, according to Harvey, he doesn't actually believe it's like the number one foundational contradiction. It's just kind of it's one of many foundational contradictions, let's put it that way. Alright, next. Capital. Is it a process or a thing? Or a bunch of things? So, this one's going to be kind of a little weird, but it's actually pretty interesting. He says, the main point here is the definition of capital as a process, as a continuous flow of value through the various moments and across the various transitions from one material form to another. And as a process, capital must circulate continuously or die. There is considerable competitive pressure to accelerate the rate of circulation, to reduce the turnover time of capital. This list of technological innovations is designed to speed things up and reduce barriers posed by physical distance and time is very long. So, capital is a bunch of like components, and to its definition, I guess we could say. And the two components that seem to be in contradiction, are in contradiction, is that capital can be a bunch of things. So think of equipment, machinery, data, money, etc., etc. There's lots of physical representations of capital, basically. However, capital is also a process of accumulation, or at least it is used in a process of accumulating more capital. And that involves a lot of movement. And like it says, it has to circulate continuously or die out. Capital constantly has to be moving throughout the economy in order to reproduce itself, and not just reproduce, but also, increase the amount of capital. So it's a little contradictory, right? But I think the analogy he used was light as like the wave particle duality, which is kind of cool as an analogy, because obviously that puzzled physicists for quite a while, because they're like, man, it really looks like it's kind of both at the same time, even though that doesn't make sense in like an intuitive way. But indeed, that is exactly how light behaves.
Gotta love the slit experiment.
Yeah, and he basically and actually, there's a lot of things that are also processes, and processes that are at any given moment a thing. So, yeah, kind of a fun, interesting one, I guess. And this is also kind of an interesting point, right? Is that in order to accelerate your rate of circulation, you need to have technological innovation, usually. Right, so like we went from trains and like horse-drawn carriage and steamboats to coal-powered. Well, that's probably what steamboats are, anyways. It's coal-powered. Well, then you fast forward, and now you've got like oil and gas-powered everything: cars, planes, trains, automobiles. Trains, I guess, are still coal for the most part. Although nowadays you have electric trains as well that can go pretty fucking fast. So yeah, there's like kind of always a drive within capitalism for speeding everything up, and including, think of like transactions being faster, right? Whereas, I know when I was a kid, like I think writing a check was regarded as like the fastest way to get money from one person to another. Like, think about that. How many of us have written a check within my landlord's fucking ancient and old school as fuck, and she needs a check, so that's the only thing I write a check for anymore. It's for fucking rent. But other than that, I don't think I write checks for just about anything anymore, because it's online payments are just way fucking faster. And that makes sure money moves around much, much quicker than it used to.
That's had me wondering somewhat recently just about the history of the internet in general. I've been wondering, like, how history is going to look back on things we have today, like YouTube and the like. And I've also been wondering more about the early history of the internet, like how early on has it been used for a transaction? What was it originally used for? I know it was originally
part
made
of a
for
research
military.
program. Yeah, DARPA. It was used for quick access of files between places.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And what of like the early internet when it had access, when the public had access to it? What sort of things was it even used for then? In the like 90s?
I mean, ultimately, the internet is still mostly file sharing.
Yes,
Right,
that
it's
makes
just
sense.
different type. You're basically just sending packets of data this way
Yeah.
and that way. Obviously, it's upgraded now to like you can have a live stream of data. So like you're hearing my live audio feed
Yes.
and my live video feed, etc. So it's almost a continuous stream of packets versus discrete packages. But yeah, I mean, the internet was invented, like Ithar said, it was invented just as like a file sharing network for research scientists. Which, by the way, is why I usually point out to people who are like, oh, ew, like torrenting and blah, blah. I'm like, that's literally what the internet was made for, is file sharing, so it's cool. But
Sorry
yeah,
for the tangent.
Ultimately, I think it's just been used that way anyways. From the start, it's just gotten more efficient over time and much, much faster. Which, yeah, I mean, that kind of follows with this statement, right? Of as a lot of capitalism moves online as a way of facilitating exchange, there became pressure to innovate around making things faster and easier to buy online. Like, I could go buy pretty much anything, any piece of junk I want right now in probably like less than 10 minutes. So yeah, that kind of, that's sort of what this one's all about a little bit. Because I think he also mentions, right, technological innovations designed to speed things up is also applies to like communication technology. All right, so like evolving from handwritten letters to like telegrams, and then like early telephone and radio, and then you got like television and all that, and then yeah, finally our most recent iteration is the internet. All this just serves to accelerate all that circulation of money. Alright, last of the foundational contradictions is the contradictory unity of production and realization. So I've mentioned this in a couple of the other previous presentations before, but I'll go over it. Capitalism as a social formation is perpetually caught in this contradiction. It can either maximize the conditions for the production of surplus value, and so threaten the ability I should just say the capacity to realize surplus value in the market, or keep effective demand strong in the market by empowering workers, and threaten the ability to create surplus value in production. In other words, if the economy does well according to the Volume 1 prescriptions, this is Volume 1 of Capital, it is likely to be in trouble from the standpoint of Volume 2, and vice versa. So, I've mentioned this before, right, but think about it, right? If you want to maximize your conditions for production of surplus value, that essentially has to do with not paying your workers as much, so slashing wages and so forth. But if you slash wages too aggressively because you're trying to make money, you still have to sell all the shit that you're making. And if all the workers in the economy are too poor to buy the shit that they're making, you're not going to actually realize any of that profit. And that's a problem. That's how huge recessions and depressions happen. And then you can also go the other way. And this is sort of what Keynes did, again, with the New Deal. They flipped the script to the other, they, kind of flipped the principal and secondary contradictions to go the other way around, where they said, oh, we're going to boost effective demand by increasing wages and making sure workers have more money. And we're also going to socialize certain social benefits, so they're not spending money on that stuff, and they can buy it, and they can spend that money instead on just commodities in the market. But the issue there is that if everyone has enough money to buy stuff, then that means you're paying them too much, and you're not going to make as much money either. So this contradiction is all about profit, because the capitalist needs to make money or make profit through, number one, producing commodities, and then number two, selling them to people. And doing both at the same time, turns out, is very difficult. Or at least it's very difficult to do that and make a lot of money. Now, obviously this contradiction has been present from the beginning, and the capitalists know about it. Believe me, they're very conscious of this. So they come up with a number of solutions to it. Number one, really, let's look at the timeline. So if you go back when Marx was writing, for example, he talks about how what we would nowadays call the imperial core, like the early industrialized countries of Europe, so your Britain, France, Germany, etc., they were operating in the production sphere mostly, right? They're constantly pumping out commodities and so forth, and they're realizing profits by for example, selling shit overseas to kingdoms beyond, or maybe their colonies, or something like that. I think, wasn't this called, like, I guess this would be like early mercantilism also. So it's sort of like old school capitalism was more like this. Whereas new school capitalism, aka imperialism, as we learned from Lenin, is a little bit more flipped around, where the imperial core countries are actually more focused on realizing profits. So think about and this kind of process has been underway throughout the 20th century, up until now, really. But you have these, first world, more developed countries becoming more consumer-based societies, right? We work so that we can have enough money just to consume shit that is produced overseas somewhere and produced in the quote-unquote third world, basically. Because we have, because basically in search of lower wages and huge populations to exploit, capital said, yeah, we're not getting it done in like Europe and America, right? Turns out all these social reforms to prevent full-scale revolution kind of eats into our profits, right? Because the productive sphere is suffering, and that means all these people have a lot of money. So what are we going to do? We're going to move our production. Like I said, contradictions tend to move instead of just evaporate. We're going to move our production somewhere else, somewhere where there's a population we can exploit much more easily. And then we're going to sell stuff back to the workers in the first world who have money to spend. So capital has been adapting to this contradiction. And again, this is a great example of just like how Mao talks about, right, a contradiction has a principal aspect and a secondary aspect. So in the US, for example, or just Europe, the first world, quote unquote, I think you'd say that the principal aspect would be realization or consumerism, and the secondary aspect is production. Whereas if you go to like China or India, or these countries that are currently being inundated with capital for productive purposes, so producing a bunch of stuff, their contradiction is flipped. So for them, the principal aspect of the contradiction is production, and the secondary aspect is realization. Because typically, well, I won't say typically, but in some cases, right, they're not making enough money to buy the things that they're making. Because that stuff just gets, they build it, and then it gets shipped right back to the first world, so that the rich Westerners can buy it. So, and usually it's had like I think in some, I don't actually know much about like the theoretical basis of what they call like super profits or super exploitation, but that's essentially what it is about, I believe, is in the sense where you've got production and realization happening in two completely different parts of the world. And I believe that is like basically the underpinning basis for super profits. So anyways, yeah, this is a big one. And when we do get to capital eventually, we'll be seeing this pop up every once in a while. And if we ever get to volume 3 by some miracle, then this is what volume 3 is all about. Is analyzing, like it says, how volume 1 and volume 2 are in contradiction with one another. And volume 3 goes into a lot of that. So I guess read that if you want to learn more. Okay, part 2 is the moving contradictions, but like I said, I'm skipping this part. So instead, I'm going to jump straight to part 3, which is the dangerous contradictions. And by dangerous, we're talking about dangerous to capital. because that is, of course, the subject of our study. But they're also pretty dangerous to human life as we know it as well. But specifically capital in this case. All right. I'm sure we've all heard of this one. It's pretty glaring, but we'll go over it a little bit. Endless compound growth. That's a big one. So, is it possible to have perpetual compounding growth for all of time? Let's think about that. So, I just got some not random, but basic ass data from just simple Google search. Nothing too exciting. We have world GDP from, I don't know, what is that, 1950 or something to now. It fits a compound growth curve pretty well. And that's, I think, in the book, he says that's like an average growth rate of like 3%, give or take. And then you can see here, this is also giving us the, actually, well, I guess the average of this is 3. But you might all notice that on a long enough timeline, there's a macro trend that this is dropping. What did we learn about the falling rate of profit? Yeah. It's a pretty clear macro trend that on a long enough timeline, you just simply cannot sustain growth like that. So this graph essentially answers this question in the negative, saying clearly the data does not suggest that that is possible. The other things that we can point out here, obviously we can see visually the peaks and valleys of the boom-bust cycle pretty clearly. It's roughly every decade, right? You got 2020, just before 2010, just after 2000, looks like 91, 82 or so. This one's right in the middle of the 70s, so on and so forth, right? And the other trend that we might notice is that each crash, or at least the aggregate trend, is that each crash tends to dip the economy much lower than the previous crash. So, again, what we might take away from that is that the contradictions are sharpening. It is becoming more and more difficult as the world GDP grows. Right, it's hard to grow $96 trillion by 3%, because the previous year was only like, I don't know, eyeball it looks like 91 trillion or something. Right.
I did want to ask something.
Mm-hmm.
So I've talked a little bit about this with some of my more liberal-leaning friends, and one very common thing I hear brought up is that this isn't actually just the nature of capitalism to go through a boom and bust cycle, but that most of these things were caused by circumstances that are not quite a part of it. For example, think of the oil crash in the 70s that was caused by, the Arab countries not wanting to give us oil. Or you can also think of the .com crash or the housing crash.
Do you mean things that immediately intrinsically tie themselves back to it?
Yeah, essentially. That's sort of where the criticism is. It answers itself. But how would you succinctly explain how it's tied to that?
I might actually see if I can. Let's see. Is it this one? Hold on. It might be. Yep, here we go. I'm going to skip forward just a bit just to answer this. This is the next chapter called Capital's Relation to Nature. So this is all about how capitalism is ravishing the planet. But to answer that question really quickly, There's a good section on it. The stranglehold that the rentier class has over so-called natural assets and resources allows it to create and manipulate scarcities and to speculate on the value of the assets they control. This power has long been in evidence. That is the cause of many crises, because you have private ownership over natural resources, which, like we said, is already a contradiction. But it creates really big problems, because you get to control the supply of a natural resource if you own it. And then you are also allowed to take your capital and speculate on the market on the value of those assets that you control the supply of. So you're allowed to either, like, do you know what that means basically, right? So you can basically bet, more or less. You're just betting on whether or not, like, the price of oil will go up or down. But if you own the oil, you get to rig the bet in your favor. But part of the deal is that if I bet on oil shorting, so becoming less valuable, the only way I can guarantee that happens is if I manipulate a scarcity. I just cut off the supply of oil to make sure prices rise. That's what causes these massive, massive crises, is because a lot of people lose the bet and lose the money, and it gets appropriated in one person who is rigging it. So that's what causes crashes of, like, scarcity crashes, is they're usually manipulated by people behind the scenes who can actually pull the strings.
And usually for the point and entirely driven by the purpose of asset aggregation.
Yeah, it's capital accumulation. And like we said, not all capital accumulation occurs the same way. It's not always in the way of just like, oh, I'm just going to exploit my workers. Like, no, I can just rob another capitalist of all of their capital.
Yes.
Right? That's another way. That's a perfectly valid way of doing it.
2 words: bank run.
Yeah. So
A
that's what I would
very
tell,
literal take on that.
that's what I would. There's a number of ways to answer that, but that is I think one of the most potent.
I would
ways of
say
answering
so.
it. Is
Yes.
Yeah, it's private property. No, it's no good.
Mm-hmm.
That's why Marx says that, like, the goal of all communists is to abolish private property.
Yeah.
Getting cut
So in
right to
other
the core
words,
of it.
yeah, it's private property. It's owned by the hands of a few. These hands have the power to basically name the value of this, private property.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, they will further chase accumulation of wealth. But it's unsustainable, so it crashes. To put it in its most basic terms.
Yes. And that's also how crises of inflation happen. It's a little bit different, but I hear a lot of liberals say, "Oh, injecting money into the economy just, like, magically makes everything more expensive." It's like, no, the capitalists intentionally made it more expensive. Like, the
Yes.
government isn't the one raising prices. It's the capitalists.
I remember Richard Wolff explaining that very well in his time on the one episode over last summer.
Exactly. And he's right. Yeah, I mean, the capitalist class is the ones raising prices, not the government. So yeah, it's usually a way of getting people to point the finger the wrong way, unfortunately. And I think Richard Wolff does say this, right? He's like, inflation just means a general rise in prices, but who's raising prices? I mean, there's only one class that gets to decide, and that's the capitalists. So blame them. So the other thing I wanted to point out, and he goes over this in the text. Let me see if I can find this page, actually. And you can see the third graph I added from our good old buddies at the IMF. There is a pretty strong correlation between debt and GDP. How interesting. So it turns out that, and you can see that the y-axis here is debt as a percentage of GDP. Notice that when they began taking data, public debt was 100% of GDP. In other words, they were equal. And it has only risen from there. So there's a few glaring things with all of these graphs kind of mushed together, right? So we see that our growth rate has been declining over the years, and every time it crashes bigger and bigger, or just more catastrophically. And yet it keeps rising. How is that possible? Well, a lot of it is supported by debt, public or private. And so a lot of that capital that's being accumulated, our so-called global domestic product, or global gross domestic product, or whatever, it's not real. It's literally like fictitious capital, because it's just money other people owe each other. And indeed, in a lot of these crashes, if you lost one of these huge bets, like just speculating on the market, and you suddenly are, you have someone basically saying, hey, you owe me like $500 billion, and you don't have fucking $500 billion. You're just automatically in debt to that other entity. And they might also just straight up say, okay, I own all your shit now, and also you're going to work for me, and anything you produce is mine. We'll give you enough crumbs to survive. That's also how capital concentrates and accumulates into fewer and fewer hands. So again, I'm just kind of using this as an example of, this is one of the more sinister ways that capital accumulates in so few hands, is through accumulation of debt as well as capital. And this is also, by the way, kind of an extrapolation, because if they had data that went back to the time of, say, when Lenin was writing Imperialism, a lot of this stuff started happening when the finance capital started becoming primary, right? Because ultimately, the rentier class that I was just mentioning is a lot of time, in most cases, controlled by finance capital, or they are the rentiers, basically. They're the ones who own all this debt. And it's very weird and, again, just contradictory. Because I've even heard this from liberals and such, where they're like, it doesn't really make sense how the global debt is 2.5 times higher than what the globe produces every year.
250%.
Yeah, percent. So 2.5 times units. Yeah, but yeah, it's a glaring contradiction. And guess what? It's only getting worse. And every crisis, there's a nice big bump in the amount of debt that. And wow, I mean, obviously our most recent crisis was quite a healthy jump in debt for everybody involved. So yeah, things are not, the tensions are not easing, they are only tightening, unfortunately. All right, now we know that capital requires wage labor in order to accumulate. So that begs the question, if you want this sort of sustained compound growth for the rest of eternity, where are you going to get the human beings to continuously do that? And so it brings up the question, can population growth supply capital with enough labor to sustain that kind of growth? The answer is no. It is pretty clear that capital accumulation in the long-term future can rely less and less upon demographic growth to sustain or impel its compound growth. And indeed, what we see from the data is that the rate of population growth has been slowly declining since they started taking data. Well, I guess not for right after World War II, but since the 70s, it's been slowly declining. And this is basically what most demographers have predicted. And you can see here there's a little projected curve is, if there's anyone who knows what the fuck this is called, it's like
Regressions.
no, it's a term from like biology, like population dynamics, like this type
Oh.
of curve.
Do you mean, which one are you specifically talking about? You mean
It's
an
like,
L curve?
is it L? No, because it's where it's exponential for half of it, and then
Yeah.
negative exponential the other half.
Oh, so
Or
it's
like it
an
flattens
S-shaped
out.
curve?
Yeah, it's S. It's a big S. It's
Yes.
logarithmic the second half.
Yeah, yes.
I don't remember. It basically plateaus. Basically, is the point, right? So
Yeah.
this is, take this graph for what you will, but this is the general shape. So we've lived through previously the period of like most intense growth, super rapid. But even in our lifetime, it is already significantly slowed down, and will continue to slow down until it
Pretty
hits
sure.
basically like a carrying capacity.
I'm fairly certain we're actually going to reach 9 billion within like the next month or two by the end of the year. I'm taking a human geography class right now, and
9?
we're
Have we
yeah,
even
yeah,
hit
9
8?
billion. Eight, not 9. I'm sorry,
Okay.
8
I
billion.
was like,
We're incredibly close to 8, not 9,
yeah,
not
I
yet.
remember when we hit 7 billion. I think I was in high school.
Yeah, we're at, I think, in my first exam for that class, we basically had to guess the world population within like 20 million, I believe, or 200 million. I somehow got it right, actually. But yeah, it's like 8.94 billion or something like that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, because this is
It-
2019
sitting-
from this graph, looks like, so right here, right now.
Yeah, right now it's sitting at 7.98.
Yep. And
Yeah,
I
not
guess they'll probably put the data point
Yeah.
for 2021
7.
on Google's version of the graph by the end of the year. So we know the change between 2021 and 2022. So yeah, and I'm sure if this trend continues, right, it will peter out. It's going to basically asymptotically approach 0. Right, that's basically this trend. It'll just keep decaying until it hits 0, and we hit like a steady rate of growth, or not steady rate of growth, steady state where there is no population growth. It's sort of constant for probably until humans move off planet and we start, I don't know, putting massive fucking greenhouses on the moon or some shit. I don't know.
There's also another biological phenomenon, though I don't believe it's going to happen here, but there's something called a die-off, where a population grows too quickly and very greatly overexceeds its carrying capacity, and there's a huge die-off, and the carrying capacity is massively reduced as a result of the trauma on the environment that it had while it was well above its carrying capacity.
Rabbits are infamous for that particular experiment because they will continuously eat until everything in an area is bare.
Yeah.
Then it collapses and a huge portion of the population just starves to death.
Yeah, I wouldn't. It's funny because, like, while humans are kind of doing that, or following that trend of ravaging the environment in which we, inhabit, it's not like we have to.
Yeah, no,
Right?
of course we don't.
Difference. That's the big difference, is we can rationally choose not to do this.
Another thing you could probably like blame the growth somewhat on capitalism for its constant need for labor. Partially, not just for population growth, but also the ecological damage that's being done.
Yeah.
absolutely for climate change, and
There
if
is
if things
there is a ideological reason and rationality for, you know, super reactionary politics to, you know, enforce traditional gender roles and make sure women don't have access to reproductive care, so that they basically stay home, have as little autonomy as possible, and just pump out children like there's no tomorrow.
yeah
It's
See
this
that.
graph is why they
the social
know
stance of women
they are conscious that the population growth is declining because people are having fewer and fewer kids. They know that. We know that. Everyone knows that. And that's not good for capital. That's really bad. It's even worse because it's not just like because of, well, I guess it is because of material conditions ultimately. But that capital is ultimately creating. That's the great irony, and I guess you could say another contradiction of the whole thing.
It is also noting that capital deliberately ignores ecological damage until after a collapse has happened.
Yeah.
It's in the Dust Bowl. You see this in every major agricultural failure post-feudalism, and even during it, because it was and then they ripped all the nutrients out of the soil and society collapsed.
I would like to mention that if things do continue, if things continue, there will be a die-off if we continue the current rate of ecological destruction. Because it's not just climate change. There's a ton of other stuff happening, like a soil crisis and just pollution in general.
So, I was going to say, like, just to comment on that really quickly. I mean, like I said, there's reason to believe the human population doesn't behave like other animal populations, because there's lots of reasons. But I would even, like, we are causing a mass die-off of other species, not just ourselves.
Yeah.
But also millions and millions of people die every year of completely preventable causes.
Failure
even just
of
simple it's even like down to just distributional problems and like lack of infrastructure and investment. So it's like a die-off in slow motion.
How much would you say die from preventable causes? I mean, there's 9 million from hunger every year, but there's probably like many times more than that just for easily treatable health conditions. It could be like 100 million a year, really.
I don't have the data on that stuff in front of me, but I'm sure it's out there. Yeah.
Our World and Data and Johns Hopkins are probably the places you want to poke at for that. They likely have logs of it, especially easily preventable from things like malnutrition. And
I did skip over one of the chapters I skipped over is called Social Reproduction. That actually does tackle a lot of this type of stuff. It's basically like, it's talking all about how capital completely handicaps like people's ability to reproduce, essentially, and not just like die short, miserable lives. So yeah, we can definitely go into that in more detail another time. Find all those graphs of data, all the fun stuff,
and just kind of
sad stuff.
Last tack onto that feedback thing. When dealing specifically with how the human mind processes data, after a specific temperature gradient, right about 50 degrees Celsius, you're going to be operating at half capacity the entire time you're in that heated area. People don't think well in fucking volcanoes for a reason. We're not built for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. We'll get to the ecological stuff in just a second here. So, a few more tidbits on the compound growth side. For all capitalists to realize a positive profit requires the existence of more value at the end of the day than there was at the beginning. That means an expansion of the total output of social labor. Without that expansion, there could be no capital. A zero-growth capitalist economy is a logical and exclusionary contradiction. It simply cannot exist. And then I threw this in, and this is where I was just mentioning the crises of inflation. But to go over it real quick, when the U.S. Federal Reserve engages in quantitative easing, and so it simply creates as much liquidity and money as it wants. Adding a few zeros to the quantity of money in circulation is no problem. The danger, of course, is that the result will be a crisis of inflation. So this was, in context of the text, this was also talking about how, like, nowadays money is largely digitized, and it's very easy to manipulate currency for, like, a central bank, for example. But that comes with its own problems of and contradictions, like inflation, for example, right? So I guess the idea was that, oh, well, if all of our money is digital and we move away from cash or any kind of hard money, like, why can't we just keep adding zeros to the end of our bank accounts for the rest of time? And his answer is basically, well, that has all kinds of troubles on its own. And we are currently living through an inflationary period. So, like, obviously, yeah, it's not a foolproof plan, guys. Not to mention, like I said, the further you abstract money away from social value or social labor that is the basis for its value, the more meaningless and that the money becomes, basically. And this is what inflation ultimately is a cycle that it causes, right? So yeah, there's tons and tons and tons of money that's all just numbers, but if I can't even buy my basics with it, then, like, what the fuck is the point of endless growth, right? So yeah, it's not a solution to the contradiction. One more. The extensive physical infrastructures required, along with the need to generate more and more energy in usable form, militate against the idea that production can ever become immaterial. The turn towards immaterial, and I added this as information-based, production and spectacle is more like a last gasp of capital rather than the opening of a new horizon for endless accumulation. The impact upon environmental contradictions is likely to be huge, as we will shortly see. So this is also just pushing it back against the capitalist apologists and so forth that will, they're going to, I'm sure at least some of us have heard of, like, the whole, we're living through, like, the fourth industrial revolution because everything's going to be information technology and information-based economy from now on. And it's like, that still has a material basis, guys, and turns out it uses the more we kind of lean into that information-based economy, the more energy it uses, and because it has to continuously expand, that accelerates the environmental damage that is going to result. So no, let's not do that. Actually, that is what we call a bad idea. And actually, I don't think he mentions, like, crypto or Bitcoin or anything like that, because it was probably written before that became a thing. But this is, like, a perfect example. It literally explains, like, the issues behind Bitcoin mining and crypto, like, perfectly. I mean, this is exactly the biggest problem with it. It's not some sort of solution that will ease the contradictions of capitalism, blah, blah, blah. It's not some miracle way out of the pickle. It's just more of the pickle.
My friend told me that crypto is still backed by labor because it takes a certain amount of energy to produce. Just throwing that in there.
I'm not saying you can't use it as a means of exchange.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you can buy all kinds of drugs with crypto. But, I mean, so yeah, I know it's still...
And guns!
Oh.
For the right
Yeah, no, I mean, that's actually the entire point of this quote, is that it's not a change, right? It's not different from capitalism. It's still just capitalism. It's still money. It still has a material basis. It's just that the irony is that it's a worse material basis than paper money is. Because now we're burning coal for representation of money instead of cutting down trees. I don't know. That's maybe not the best example because cutting down trees is also not a great idea, but I digress. All right, let's get to another obviously super, super big one that I know a lot of us are probably... I think these last three, like what he calls the dangerous contradictions, I would also say are almost like, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but they're kind of like the gateway contradictions for a lot of people. They're the ones that are the most glaring for the average person. Because they're so obvious and so hard to, like, justify. So anyways, let's get into the darkness. Nature is necessarily viewed by capital as nothing more than a vast collection of potential use values, things and processes that can be used in the production and realization of commodity values. Private property entails the enclosure of nature's commons. Even genetic modifications are now claimed as private intellectual property. The stranglehold that the rentier class has over so-called natural assets and resources allows it to create and manipulate scarcities and to speculate on the value of the assets they control. This power has been long in evidence.
My God.
Actually, I will also... I'm going to continue that last quote. This will hopefully give more context to what you're saying. He says, "It is now generally accepted, for example, that almost all famines over the last 200 years have been socially produced and not naturally ordained. Every time rising oil prices provoke a chorus of commentary on the natural limits of peak oil, it is followed by a period of rueful remorse as it realizes that it was the speculators and the oil cartel who together pushed the oil prices up." So there's the context of what exactly what you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah. I'm reminded quite instantly of patents. That's a big one. I've even heard like some like actual like specific color codes are patented, like specific shades of a given color. You also have patents for words or for people that try and use them.
Guys.
Mangas.
Have a good night.
Yeah. You see this even most atrocious, I believe, in India. And it's been a while since I remember hearing of this, but there was this one form of genetically modified rice they were using because it was necessary, essentially, to sustain the population. They needed it for subsistence. And it was, of course,
a well-known villain in that realm of
it was
controlling biological assets and genetic
it was
codes
privately
and stuff.
owned. And that's the most heinous thing here, honestly. So another thing is just like chemical compounds. I remember hearing of a university that was running simulations on how to create chemical compounds so that they could, keep them from being privately patented. It's just so messed up. Not only can you own a natural resource. At this point, you are literally able to own a concept of nature itself. It's so disturbing.
Oh yeah, I know one of the earliest things that kind of, especially when I look back on it, it's easier to see in hindsight. But one of the earlier things that like began my radicalization was just the simple fact that like a lot of scientific papers are super hard to get to because they're paywalled in journals and stuff. Honestly, same thing with any sort of media I want to consume, TV show, movie, video game, whatever. It's like, damn, it sucks that this is behind a paywall. I guess I'll just pirate it. And it's the same thing with like, journal articles. It's like their entire business model is gatekeeping basic scientific information about the universe. and how the world works. It's like, that's pretty ridiculous if you think about it. But yeah, I mean, literally anything that is private property is just a little piece of the universe that some human being says, oh yes, this is mine. No one else can use it. It's like so fucking dumb. Like there's almost no way to justify that. Especially when you do kind of zoom out to like, right, a global scale or even like a universe scale. It's like, are we really that freaking stupid that we think we can be like, yes, this chemical bond is mine? It's like, dude, come on. What the heck?
I think I would take it far past dumb to straight up petty.
It is.
It
It's the
is.
most
It's
arrogant
also straight up
thing.
evil, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's usually used to. You're right that like the whole justification is to exploit other people. Right, the whole purpose of private property is that it's I can use it, but you can't. That's the point, I guess. Or I guess it's more like, if you do use my intellectual property, then the state will come and do violence on you, throw you in jail or something, or make you pay a fine or whatever it is. Alright, keep it going here. The temporal and geographical scale of capital's ecosystem has been shifting in response to exponential growth. Whereas the problems in the past have been largely localized, they have now become regional or global. And some examples of this: climate change, global urbanization, habitat destruction, species extinction, loss of biodiversity, degradation of oceanic, forest, and land-based ecosystems, and uncontrolled use of chemical compounds with unknown side effects. I'm sure there's more, but those are obviously a lot of the big ones. And then this is kind of another point that I think is interesting, right? That what is ultimately destroyed in the process is the capacity to be human in any other way than that which capital requires and dictates. So yeah, all the fun ways of living are illegal. You go to jail.
For something that is sometimes viewed as a god, it's very malevolent, I have to say.
Oh yes. It is not a benevolent god by any means. Insert Nikolai's link to that Capital is a Living God article. It's
I thought it was
it's in the pinned posts of the book club channel.
Thank you.
All right. Last one of the dangerous contradictions is universal alienation. So, again, I think this is where a lot of people are conscious of the of this contradiction of capital, even if they don't know how to express it. And it says, so we're just gonna go through it, right? So he says, capital will never fall on its own. It'll have to be pushed. The accumulation of capital will never cease. It will have to be stopped, and the capitalist class will never willingly surrender its power. It will have to be dispossessed. Dystopian tales abound, depicting a grand variety of such worlds where capitalism continues, and it would be wrong to rule them out as impossible blueprints for a less than human humanity. So basically, like I kind of alluded to in the very beginning of the presentation, we should basically take for granted that without any outside influence from revolutionary activity, that is, capital is going to keep on chugging as it goes. And when he continues, the issue is not therefore that capital cannot survive its own contradictions, but that the cost of doing so becomes unacceptable to the mass of the population. that this means replacing the economic engine and its associated irrational economic rationalities should be obvious. And then kind of furthermore, it divorces work from life and occupational culture from the culture of everyday life. It demands a despotic domination of oneself in exchange for an increased domination of nature. It reduces the field of lived experience and existential autonomy. It separates the producer from the product to the point where they no longer know the purpose of what they're doing. If this is not total alienation within the labor process, then what is? Alright, last one. Confronting collectively the multiple alienations that capital produces is a compelling way to mobilize against the stuttering economic engine that so recklessly powers capitalism from one kind of crisis to another, with potentially disastrous consequences for our relations to nature and for our relations to one another. Universal alienation calls for a full-blooded political response. So what might that response be? And that is for us to decide. Because if capital has its way, the only goal is total proletarianization of the entire human race, basically. And for everyone to be dispossessed of everything they could possibly own. I'm sure all of us have maybe come across those articles that are sort of alluding to like a quote-unquote rental economy. It's great because you don't have to worry about owning anything.
Oh my god. Yeah.
There's also the long-running meme: nobody will own anything. We'll all be bugs. We'll all be bugs and be
I
happy.
recently
Yeah.
I recently got like an ad on YouTube where it was like, hey, get this new app where you can rent a certain amount of clothes for a subscription fee
my
every month. Like, hey man, check this out. You can wear whatever you want.
I have to say though, like we all that stuff is fine and all, but like the eating bug thing, that's not so bad, man. Like I don't know, we shouldn't be so against that necessarily. That's pretty okay.
Bugs are like 50% of the biomass on Earth.
Yeah, I mean it's
Some of them are outright delicious. It's just the owning and being perpetually happy thing, which is kind of bizarre.
Very.
I still use a lot of 2015 era software because that's right before a lot of the software companies started rolling out subscription models.
Yeah.
And
It's also
and
it's fun
that's
if
the
you manage
new
to
that's the new hot thing.
yeah, unless you find something that generates a hex key that they haven't blocked off yet. Fuck you, Adobe.
True.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Cracked Photoshop.
Cracked everything.
And remember, it's not pirating Ubisoft. It's not proletarian. It is seizing back the means of gain. Because fuck Ubisoft, seriously.
I have I tend to do the same thing with most software that I have if I can. If it's subscription based, of course, like you gotta do that. Never mind. I was gonna say, okay. Apologies for my scatterbrain here, but subscription services are somewhat fascinating to me. Because of the relation to labor, right? You have people that create this one product, right? And they roll out, changes here and there, but ultimately it's the same product from the beginning. And you're basically having to pay for it over and over and over again, and it feels like it magnifies the exploitation somewhat in my mind, a little bit.
It also totally disproves the what's it called? Diminishing marginal utility theory of value.
Yeah.
It literally completely disproves it. Because you basically keep, like, they argue that the more you buy of something, the less useful it is or something.
Yeah.
like essentially the entire thing you can boil down to that they just equivocate use value and exchange value. They're like, oh, people buy stuff because it's useful, and they're not going to buy a second lawnmower, or like a second lawnmower is not worth as much to them because they already have a lawnmower.
Yeah,
It's like, okay, well, how do you
sort of
explain?
Econ 101.
Now imagine a situation where you don't own a lawnmower and you have to rent one every week. Like,
I mean,
ultimately, it's price. Like you still, that you can still make you can make way fucking more money that way.
one word: landlords.
Yeah, and actually, I think
It's literally
that's in
that
here
system,
somewhere. Hold on.
the socioeconomic ladder.
Yeah. Yeah, here we go. I'll actually read this from the Endless Compound Growth chapter as well. Let's see. What this... actually, I'll go back. I'll actually read a little bit about the 2008 crash as well. Much of the compound growth realized until the financial crash of 2008 was achieved by way of speculative gains out of successive asset bubbles. The dot-com boom and the bust of the 90s, followed by the property market boom and bust of the 2000s in the USA. The speculative froth concealed, however, some very important real transitions occurring in investment behaviors after the 1970s. Some of the assets being purchased, land and property, natural resources, were secure and grounded and could be held for long-term gain. This made the booms and busts particularly helpful to long-term investors who could purchase assets at fire sale prices in the wake of a crash with the prospects of making a long-term killing. This is what many of the banks and foreign investors did during the Southeast Asian crisis of 1997-8, and what investors are now doing is they buy up masses of cheap foreclosed housing in, for example, California, to rent out until the property market revives. This is what the hedge funds do, though under very different conditions, when they short sell in fictitious capital markets. But what this means is that more and more capital is being invested in search of rents, interest, and royalties rather than in productive activity. This trend towards a rentier form of capital is reinforced by the immense extractive power that increasingly attaches to rents on intellectual property rights to genetic materials, seeds, licensed practices, and the like. Small wonder that the U.S. government has fought so fiercely through international institutions to protect and forcibly impose an intellectual property rights regime on others, by way of the so-called TRIPS agreement within the framework of the World Trade Organization. So, and actually, it's kind of funny that Harvey's writing about this as if it's sort of a newer trend. But this is what Lenin was writing about, guys. I mean, that's pretty much what Lenin meant by the domination of finance capital. Is essentially it's a class of, they're capitalists, but their behavior is very much like rent-seeking behavior or interest-seeking behavior.
If you're going to believe playing the game of argue with the lib, even John Smith warned against this particular trend within capital. It takes
Adam Smith?
500 poor men. Yeah, Adam Smith. It takes 500 poor men to support one very rich man, and where there is great pretty straight out of the wealth of nations.
Yep. I think that's also sort of the basis for, like, has anyone ever seen those videos of, I think it's, what's his name, like Yanis Varoufakis, I think, where he mentioned like, oh, we're in an era of like techno-feudalism or something, I think is what he called it.
Yeah, it's Giannis being and trying to fix a new hype phrase to an old system.
That's what I was thinking too. I'm like, yeah, he's basically just trying to like be edgy amongst the Marxists. We're in a new age of capitalism. It's like, nah, not really.
No, we're in the same age.
Even Lenin was very careful to be like, even though I'm calling this imperialism, it's still capitalism, guys. Like, it's
Yeah.
still the same old.
Giannis is a Marxist. He just happens to be one who likes fancy new shiny things.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. It's he's basically just like modernizing Lenin's language, I would say. But the trends he is referring to are actually real. Even if he gives weird names to them.
Trends are real, the language is dirt.
I mean, as long as it gets the point across, right? It's always better to explain a bunch of things in many different ways so that it hits from many different angles, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I mean, you shouldn't like totally discount the use of analogies to feudalism, for sure.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you wanted to be a smartass about it, you could call modern capitalism, not modern capitalism, mercantilism as aristocraticalism, but it's still just a predecessor to modern capital and a very slight outgrowth of old aristocracy.
Mm-hmm.
On terminology, one thing that annoys a friend of mine quite a lot is the amount of vocabulary that's just involved with these ideas. There's so many different terms for everything. So I don't know. This is largely irrelevant, but I feel like it can be off-putting to some people. Just the terminology for some of these things we have on the
It's
left.
part of a very, very old problem known as jargon walling that
Yeah.
Yeah.
it traces itself back to the earliest iterations of academia.
Well, and that's where I mean, one of the impetuses for the book club was to help people, even myself included, like internalize these concepts. And that's, to be so comfortable with them that you just kind of automatically, you see alienation, you're like, oh, I know exactly what that means.
Yeah, like jargon is one thing, but the concepts are like the underlying thing. So like
Right.
there, even though there's a lot of jargon, once you understand the concepts, all of the jargon kind of just, well, not immediately and not easily, but much more easily than before falls into place, and
It
you can
does.
understand it.
I think examples are also really helpful for that. I mean, even I can even think back to like taking engineering classes, right? Like if you verbally describe to me some engineering problem, it's gonna go right over my head. I'm like, I'm not sure what you're talking about. But if you like do the example problem on the board and like walk through it, okay, here's the situation, here's the system, these are the different components that we're going to be looking at, here's how they interact, here's the formula on how to solve it, blah blah blah. Yeah, I think examples are very nice. And I know I didn't give an example for every single contradiction here, but there are in the book. If anyone, actually don't, I'm not sure if did I track down the PDF for this. Hold on, let me double check.
Analogies and stories also are just, they're in the same vein as being really important for chunking these ideas down for people.
Yeah. Okay, if someone can track down the PDF and post it in the book club channel, that'd be awesome. I'll take a look for
Yeah,
it in a
I'll
minute. But
try that once I get back home.
What is the PDF? What is the book called again?
17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism by David Harvey.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's by David Harvey. Okay. I'll look.
It's 2014, I think. That's when it was published.
I'll find a PDF.
Yeah, I totally forgot to post one in case anyone wanted to. I just figure I'm like, well, it's like how many pages is this fucking book? It's over 300 pages, so I'm like, way more than a week's read.
Yeah.
It took me more like a few months, but yeah, it's a really fucking good book. Like I said,
Yeah, it does sound good.
it's really helped me like engage with a lot of the other texts as well, because
17 Contradictions of Capitalism?
17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Also worth remembering the old XKCD poster of Explain Rock using the 1,000 most common words in the English language. Because if you use that to open the initial door, it's a hell of a lot easier to get people interested in, even if it sounds kind of ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. That's also
So,
why I love Karl Marx's. I usually
Ooh,
jokingly
people
call it
often-
his D&D fanfic when he writes about capital as like a D&D monster that sucks people's souls out. It's very cool.